Hi, I'm Kim Flottam, editor of Bee Culture, the magazine of American beekeeping. Our series of beekeeping workshops covers everything from the not yet beginner to the seasoned commercial operator. I believe we've got something here for everybody. Did you know that every month Bee Culture covers how-to articles, columns and editorials by America's best beekeeping writers, market updates, and I think just plain good beekeeping information. Check out on how to order Bee Culture, the magazine of American beekeeping, on the screen in a moment, and then sit back, relax, and enjoy another Bee Culture's beekeeping workshop. I've got to go work some bees. One of the more routine management practices beekeepers engage in is requeening their colonies. Whether it's in the spring to jumpstart their colonies, in the summer to fix a problem that's going on, or in the fall to give their colonies the best chance for overwintering. We're here in Bee Culture's Bee Yard today to talk to Jim Tu and Dave Heilman about that very subject. We're going to look at removing attendants from cages, marking queens, and using a variety of techniques successfully introducing queens into your colonies. And finally, we're going to look at some post-installation care to make sure that your queens have the very best chance possible. Come on along, I think we'll all learn something.
Hi, I'm Jim Tu from Ohio State University. We want to explore installing queens to our beehives. It's a bit of a surgical procedure to correctly go in and take a queen out and put a new queen back in. First step is to get replacement queens. There's a lot of good producers out there. Ours came in the mail to us about 3 days ago in kind of a clever box that was shipped to us. Screen on both sides for ventilation. Take the top off. It really fits snugly, so let me struggle with it for just a second. Then inside we've got 8 queens that come packed in a nice holding contraption. So you can see I can take the whole bank out, leaving my queens looking like this. And then it's just simple rubber bands that hold the queen cages together. Take one of them out, let you have a better look. So queens came in good shape. They were not, in no cases were they particularly damaged as far as I can tell. Haven't had a chance to look at all of them, but the queens all look good. One of the first things you'd obviously do is go through and be sure they're all alive. There's a dummy cage here, I'll confess to you, that was inserted here for no other reason than to support the other cages there. So there's actually 7 queens here that were shipped. And I'm happy to tell you that yes, they're all alive. Now what? 2 schools of thought. In most cases, you'd want to take the worker bees out of the cage in order to facilitate releasing and the queen being accepted and moving along more quickly in that. Of course, if that's not appropriate for you, you push for time, you don't want to handle bees or be that close to worker bees, you can still introduce the queen with the workers inside the cage. But new and more recent data indicates that the introduction procedure goes along more smoothly if in fact you take the workers out. So let's show one way for doing that procedure. But before we do this, there's one quick point I need to make. A lot of the queen cages come with the screen wire stapled in place, whereas this case has the screen wire just snapped in place. Either way, the procedure for getting the screen wire off is the same, just using a pocket knife. Be prepared for each one. We found that by taking your knife and running it down and being careful not to impale your queen, snap the screen up on both sides so that it pops up, and then gently pull it out and let the worker bees come out as they wish. We're not really getting them all that excited. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and take the screen wire completely off. Pull back the paper, exposing the candy plug. The queen is quiet. It's real common to have these worker bees fan when you do this, putting out their orientation pheromone. I want to get them out of there. Touch the queen with the tip of my knife. It can sometimes be surprising how these queens have become habituated to the cage and don't really want to leave. Okay. Pick her up by her thorax. She's not going to sting you. They do occasionally, but she rarely ever does. Hold her gently by her thorax, and at this point, I'm ready to mark her. But there's other ways for getting worker bees out of the cage, and at this point, we should have a look at some of those techniques. Dave Howman is the apiarist for Ohio State University at Worcester. He's going to show us some of the other techniques that are commonly used to get worker bees out. One of the most direct and straightforward is just using forceps to drag the worker bees out. I mean, this is not going to be a real pleasant trip for them, but it gets the worker bees out expeditiously. So he's using forceps just to go in and crush a worker bee. She's not going to survive this. Drag her out, drop her, bring another worker bee out. So you just go through the process of just sacrificing the workers, because in all honesty, they've been through a lot already and they're not going to survive inside the hive. Moving along pretty fast. Be sure you don't get the queen in the middle of all this, because she's running around too inside there. So you can take your time. When you do this, there's no particular reward for rushing through it and causing some kind of damage. But we're down now to one queen and one worker. And now, that's it. Well, the worker bees are all out. The queen's left inside alone. Now, second technique that, for those of you who don't particularly want to take the worker bees out that way, is using a cloth screened, what would you call it, Dave? Cutlet? Gauntlet? Put both hands inside. There's elastic on both ends. So once he's got his hands inside there, take the cage inside. See, the elastic now is holding it down against his hands, so the worker bees, queens, can't get out. So in case there's no window, nothing else. So Dave's got a couple of options. He can go ahead and do as before and kill the worker bees, or he can do nothing more than just wait for the worker bees to come finding their way out, or snap off the screen. I used my knife before. Dave's using the long forceps this time to pull the screen back enough to let the workers out. So you don't want to destroy the screen, because you're going to need that probably to put the queen back in for the introduction process. So kind of be protective of the screen while you're taking that off. As you can tell, you're going to have to become a lot more close and personal with the worker bees to get them out, and I can't deny the fact that you occasionally may take a sting on the fingers. Got them all out now. Put the cork back in. And there we are, down to a worker bee queen, down to a queen inside the cage alone, with the worker bees flying around inside the glove gauntlet. Marking a queen is helpful. Let you know how old the queen is if you keep up with the date like that. Marking the queen lets you know that it's still the queen that you put inside the beehive. Through the years, beekeepers have used all different kinds of things to mark queens, but I guess the most standard procedure is just a model car paint and some kind of a probe. I thought we'd just take a drone if you want to practice. Of course, drones are friendly fellows and won't sting you at all. So it's a good opportunity to use a drone to practice marking on. This is just a piece of brazing rod, a twig, broken toothpick, pencil point broken off, anything about an 1/8 inch or smaller in diameter would be a good marking probe. Ironically, I wouldn't use a brush all that much, because you end up painting the bee's eyes, and you want to keep it directly on the thorax. So all I do commonly is just dip it inside the paint that's on the lid, not the paint that's in the jar. And then I just stick it to the drone like this on its thorax, and then you get a nice little green speck there. It doesn't take a lot. If there's a disadvantage to this kind of enamel paint, it does take a few minutes for it to dry. That's just one technique. There's several others. Let's look at one of those. If you want to go to the expense, you can still buy plastic disc that glue on the back of the queen's thorax. They're numbered and they're colored. You take a small drop of glue, stick the sticker on the queen's thorax on her top. Color responds to the appropriate year. These things are commonly used in observation hives, things like that. If you're just going to be marking queens for use in your bee yard, probably not worth the effort, but they are available for you. In recent years, these paint pens have come out. You get these at clothing stores, building supply stores. I'm not sure where all you can get them. They're pretty common. And I've gotten to where I use these quite a bit. They come in a bright range of colors. Shake them up, got the metal ball inside. And then this technique does require, though, that you actually have to handle the queen. So you know the drill on that. We'll snap the screen wire off. I'm not working near the window now, so I've got to catch her real quickly. It's not an easy way to practice this, but I've got her. I'm holding her by her thorax. Take the paint pen. I've already had the cap loosened, and then I'll just stick the top of it, swirl it slightly, and I get a nice reddish colored dot there. She's squirming inside my hand, and I'll use my finger there to support her. So while that dries, three techniques. One, just using the old-fashioned dip it in the paint routine. Second is to mark the queen while I'm holding her. Third is the technique there that where you use a plastic disc. Now, if you don't like to hold the queen at all, put her back inside. The drop is fairly quiet, it's dry. Is a queen holding contrivance. The queen goes inside, pushes up against, and then with the thorax pushed through this coarse mesh, you can mark her there. Drop the queen in. Now you have to finagle things till you get her ventral side down and let her get right to a spot that centers one of those squares. That's pretty good there. Let her settle down, and then the foam rubber holds her gently, holds her in place. And then with her held there, I can take my pointer, the brazing rod, whatever I'm using, and then go through the same marking technique. Hold her the same, and instead of having to hold her in my hand, I hold her in this device that holds her steady for me. So about 4 techniques. Surely one of those will work for you. There's multiple uses for queens once you buy them. One of the things I want to use for it today is to requeen a nuke that we've made and got set up. Made a split out of a stronger colony, and we're going to bring in a new queen, introduce her in fairly traditional ways. There's nothing about it that's really uncommon. As you'll recall from the inside a bit ago, we've taken all the worker bees out, and we've got her marked with a nice red color, so she'll be able to show up for us. As you might expect, the bees are the least bit upset. Have been having their colonies already split out some, so I'm using smoke fairly liberally. Got a good deal of honey. I'm not laying the queen down, so I always know where she is, and the honey will be sticky here. 2 schools of thought. One is that you expose the candy plug and let the worker bees eat the candy plug out, thereby slowly releasing the queen. But sometimes some enthusiastic bees will eat the candy plug so fast the queen doesn't really stay in very long in her introductory process. If you have the time, it may be better to leave the cork in the candy plug in, come back 3-4 days later, and look for symptoms of aggressive bees attacking the cage before you release her directly. So at that point, turn her loose directly. If you don't have time to come back, go ahead and expose the candy plug. For the sake of our discussion today, I'll leave the candy plug in exposed. Don't need it all that much, but if I were working with a colony that was in the field, smoke the bees back, we know in this particular nuke that if we push back pretty hard on the back end here. We can open up enough space to put the queen cage in, candy plug end up. I got to avoid the end bars there. Push it down, then I tilt it over just a bit. It's brood, cap brood on both of these frames. It's in the middle of the brood nest. Decent colony, a lot of honey stores. I've got the candy plug end closed off. I'll come back about 3 days from now, have a look at the cage, make a decision about releasing her or letting her even stay a bit longer.
While Jim and Dave are getting the next colony set up, I thought I'd show you one of the techniques that you often read about in books, hear about at talks, and read in magazines. It's fast, it's expedient, but because of that it presents some problems that I want to point out to you. This is a pretty large two-story colony that I was through yesterday and removed the queen. Today I'm going to install another queen using this technique. Use a little smoke. Because I was through here yesterday, this colony is pretty clean, easy to take apart, which makes life simpler for the bees and for the beekeeper. Remove the inner cover. One of the things that I did yesterday is I took out an extra frame. And I did that so I'd have plenty of room to install this queen cage. You can see there's 8 frames here. There's usually 9. This colony is lots of brood in the bottom super and quite a bit of brood in the top super, but not completely. It has a lot of honey and some pollen stored. I've got my queen in my pocket here, keeping her warm. And what I'm simply going to do is pry apart the center frames here. You can see I've got my candy end cork removed. And I'm going to place her right in here so that the screen is completely exposed down into the brood nest. The more exposure you can get, the better. I'm going to snug that in there and we're done. I'm going to put the colony back together. I'll come back in 3 or 4 days to see how they're doing and make a decision from there. Like I said, this is a fast, expedient way to introduce a queen for a beekeeper. The downside is that the queen is not as close to the brood nest as possible, and that can present some problems if you're having cool nights or some other things are going on inside of your colony. You have to make a judgment call on the population size and whether they're going to be clustering at night. But if it's warm enough, you've got a lot of bees, this is a fast, expedient way to requeen a colony. I'm going to show you another way here in just a minute. Come on along. One of the techniques that you read about on occasion, hear people talk about, something called using a push-in cage to requeen a colony. I'm going to show you how that works today, but I don't have a queen in my cage. I've got a worker, and there's a good reason for that, and I'm going to show you why. The first thing you want to find on a colony that you're going to requeen using a push-in cage is a frame that has brood and some open space on it. You want that so you've got space underneath the cage for the queen to begin laying in. This is a head start for this queen, and it gives her a little bit of jump on what they normally have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up a frame here that has brood and open space on it so that I can find a space for her. Now that's a perfect spot right there. You can see we've had a push-in cage here before. We're going to lean this up here. Give a little smoke. Now in my pocket I've got a push-in cage here, and I've got a regular queen cage with a worker in it. Push-in cage is going to go right there, just like this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this cork out right here. I'm going to put it underneath the push-in cage like this with the screen down, so the only place that the bees inside have to go is up towards the light through the hole into the push-in cage. If I'm lucky, I'll be able to remove this, push the push-in cage down, and we'll have her trapped underneath. So let's see if this is going to work. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the cork with my hive tool. Keep my finger over the hole. Put this underneath here and wait for the bee to come out. And if we're lucky, she'll come out and we'll trap her underneath there. And she's under there. Now, if that had been a queen, we'd have been in good shape. You can see there's no foreign attendants in there with her. We push the push-in cage down into the comb, not so far to squash her, but far enough so that it's snug and that I don't dislodge it when I put the frame back in. So this is how a push-in cage works. She's under there, she has room to lay, she's right next to the brood nest, so she's going to get perfect care and attention after we put the colony back together. All right, now we're going to put the colony back together, making sure the push-in cage is in far enough so it doesn't rub up against the frame next to it when we put it back in. Very carefully putting it down. I'll come back in 2 or 3, maybe 4 days, check and see how the bees are reacting to the push-in cage, that they're not being aggressive around it, that she's inside and is moving around and healthy. If everything looks fine, then I'm going to pull the push-in cage out and release her, and we're going to have a good queen-right colony. Now that I've got this done, why don't we go back and see how Jim and Dave are doing on their colony.
An alternative procedure to the one we just did, the previous technique, is to go to a too deep colony that needs requeening and split the colony between the deeps. Go ahead and open it up, Dave. We're going to go back to the center of the brood nest again. Find 2 frames. Can you split those apart there? There you go. Slip the queen cage in till it goes above the bottom bars. You can let it go now. Crush it in so the cage is confined or trapped in that location in the center of the brood nest. Now, it's not exactly as convenient for us as it was in the top, but it's more appropriately positioned for the queen to come out into the brood nest area with a lot of nurse bees there.
No matter which technique you use to install your queens, any of those that Jim used or that you saw me do here earlier today, one of the things you've got to remember is the normal requeening time in a colony, which is spring, when there's a honey flow on. If you're requeening in the summer or in the fall and there's no honey flow or a very light honey flow, you're going to want to stimulate that activity in the colony by feeding. A medium light 1-to-1 sugar syrup being fed to a colony, even if there's some honey flow going on, is only going to help queen acceptance in your colonies. So if you remember nothing else from this, feed, feed, feed when you requeen your colonies.
As is frequently so frustrating with beekeeping, there's no precise, correct way to introduce a queen in every situation, every time. So what we tried to do in this episode today was to show you some of the techniques for releasing workers from the cages, from marking queens, using queens to populate splits, also using queens to requeen in here in the fall, and same procedure for next spring. The options that you got available to you are mark the queen using a holder if you don't want to touch her, use forceps to take out worker bees should you not want to touch them. Alternatively, go to a window, sit in the cab of your truck, close off the vent holes, release the queens in the truck so you can pull them off the windows. Mark them as you wish. When you get to the hive, if you can go back to the beehive, it's probably a bit safer to leave the candy plug in closed and go back 3 days later, check, see if the bees are treating the cage with respect. If the bees are really clutching and holding the cage tightly, they're not going to accept that queen if she's released. If you go back 3 days later, everything's quiet, you can brush the bees off, peel the wire back, as was shown earlier today, release the queen directly on the comb, give them 3 to 5 days, go back and look and see if you can find eggs in the center frame. If you can, the situation worked. Good luck. I'm Jim Tube, the Ohio State University Department of Entomology.
I hope you found today's workshop enjoyable and informative. Here's How to Order Bee Culture, the magazine of American beekeeping, and I'll see you next time.